Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and on today's episode, we're going to be discussing the 1913 novella, The Burning Secret, by Stefan Zweig. Now, Stefan Zweig is mostly famous for a nonfiction book he wrote called The World of Yesterday, which basically is the story of his childhood in Vienna, World War I, the rise of Nazism. That book was published in the 1940s, and that's maybe his most famous work, largely because it really captures a certain nostalgia that people felt right at the eve of and right around World War II about those early years, right prior to World War I. But Zweig is also known as a writer of novellas, and he's really good, as we're going to see with this one, The Burning Secret, at creating a really contained and powerful story. In this case, about a young boy who comes of age, who experiences that transformation of the self that we all experience as we grow up. And when I say contained, I really mean it. You know, this novel, the version that I have is 175 pages long, but they're pages with relatively large text. And so in some editions of this novel might be even shorter. Zweig does a really good job with what we call character arc in this novel, showing the changes that this boy undergoes in response to what is essentially a romance between his mother, a potential romance between his mother and a baron who the mother and son meet at a spa, at a resort. What's interesting about this novel, though, is that it doesn't begin with the boy. So if we think about a conventional coming-of-age story, we might think, we start with the perspective of the young boy who is going to be the protagonist of the novel. Instead, we start from the perspective of the baron. So let's look at the opening section of this novella. Let's look at the opening chapter. And then we're going to try and talk about I'll talk about my theory of why I think Stefan Zweig starts the story this way rather than, as you might expect, from the perspective of the boy himself. So at the beginning, we're introduced essentially to the primary setting where most of the novel will take place. The hotel at this resort town, at this spa town in Austria called Sommering. The train, with a shrill whistle, pulled into Sommering. For a moment, the black coaches stood still in the silvery light of the uplands to eject a few vivid human figures and to swallow up others. Exacerbated voices called back and forth. Then, with a puffing and a chugging and another shrill shriek, the dark train clattered into the opening of the tunnel, and once more the landscape stretched before the view, unbroken in all its wide expanse, the background swept clean by the moist wind. One of the arrivals, a young man pleasantly distinguished by his good dress and elastic walk, hurried ahead of the others and entered one of the hotel buses. The horses took the steep road leisurely. Spring was in the air. Up in the sky floated the white, shifting clouds of May and June, light, sportive young creatures, playfully coursing the blue path of heaven, suddenly dipping and hiding behind the mountains, embracing and running away, crumpling up like handkerchiefs, elongating into gauzy scarfs, and ending their play by roguishly perching white caps on the mountain tops. There was unrest below, too, in the wind, which shook the lean trees, still wet from the rain, and set their limbs a-groaning softly, and brought down 1,000 shining drops. Sometimes a cool breath of snow descended from the mountains, and then there was a feel in the air both balmy and cutting. All things in the atmosphere and on the earth were in motion and astir with the ferment of impatience. The horses tossed their heads and snorted as they now trotted down a descent, the sound of their bells jingling far ahead of them. Now, it's a very interesting opening because I sort of said we open with the Baron, but the Baron is really only mentioned as a young man, right? A young man of good appearance. A young man, well-dressed, distinguished by his good dress. Really, the focus of this opening is on two things. So first, the focus is on the train. The train arriving in Sommering. And this is important because at the end of the novel, the boy, Edgar, right? The boy's revelation, the boy's moment of transformation really comes when he's on a train. The train is really important. On the one hand, psychologically, it conveys this sense of movement, right? In and out movement, right? Coming into the town, leaving the town. And the boy on the train at the end is going to be really important. It's going to be a really important symbol for him of his transformation as he looks out the window of the train. And we're going to look at that scene when we get to the end. But here, so here I think the train is set up simply to obviously give us some context for the setting, right? This resort town, the spa town, where all these guests are arriving. But also I think to hint at an important symbol that will recur later. And then, of course, we have this really wonderful passage where he describes the weather. And Zweig focuses a lot on the clouds. He essentially personifies the clouds, right? The white, shifting clouds of May and June. He describes them as light, sportive young creatures. They're basically playfully dancing in the sky, embracing, running away, ending their play by roguishly perching on the mountaintops. So there is something playful about the clouds. The emphasis is almost on the clouds as these two lovers kind of carousing in the sky together. That's also important foreshadowing because, as we're going to see, this is the burning secret, in a sense, that Edgar, the young boy, learns. The burning secret about life and about sex. And that's essentially what this novel is all about. So kind of in microcosm, this image of the clouds represents, to some extent, the secret that Edgar is later going to learn, and that's going to transform him and help him grow up. More importantly, though, the passage ends with this emphasis on how all things in the atmosphere and on earth were in motion and astir with the ferment of impatience. I really like this because, and this is something I say a lot in my creative writing classes, whenever you're describing the atmosphere, whenever you're describing the setting, in order to make your setting description not just feel flat, not just feel like a default description like a placeholder description that you've put in there, you have to make the setting reflect the emotions that you want your reader to feel. So here, Zweig wants us to feel this sense of impatience in the atmosphere. He wants us to feel this sense of impatience, and so he reflects this impatience in the descriptions of the atmosphere. And this is important. We start the novel with this anxiety, this sense of movement, this sense of impatience. If this is meant to be a summer spa retreat, it's not necessarily, as he's foreshadowing here, it's not necessarily going to be a relaxing summer retreat. Now, the first chapter is entirely told from the perspective of the young man, who we're later going to learn is a baron, right? And the idea is he has come to this spa town in order to find a woman to seduce. And he says, and one of the first things he thinks is, if only there was a woman or two here to pick up a flirtation with, even a perfectly innocent one, if it must be, just to keep the week from being too utterly dismal. So the Baron is essentially our antagonist. He is the one who's going to try and seduce and flirt with Edgar's mother, even though she is married. Now, it's important, the context that we learn is the father is not there, and that there might be some problems in the marriage, might be some subtle problems in the marriage that the Baron learns to take it and decides to try and take advantage of. So that's essentially the storyline, the context of the whole novel. There is this flirtation, kind of seduction going on between this Baron and Edgar's mother, and Edgar is witnessing this, and as he gradually becomes aware of this, it changes him. So it's a very simple story on its surface, right? A boy witnesses his mother essentially dabbling in and beginning what feels like an affair, right? He sees his mother potentially about to be unfaithful, or in some cases, essentially being unfaithful to his father. And we're going to see the effect that this has on the boy. And that is essentially the story. That's the entire novella, the psychological effect that this has on the young boy. It's not what you would expect, though, when you first hear that description. And that's what I think makes this novel such a masterpiece and so intriguing of a novel, is the unexpected way that this incident, right, this flirtation that Edgar witnesses, becomes the catalyst for a very profound and moving inner change that he experiences. A very profound and inner experience of growing up. One that when I read it, I felt very moved by, because it felt like Zweig had captured the universal experience of being a child, being an adolescent, and suddenly realizing that the world was a lot bigger and more complicated than you realized. The other question we should ask, though, of course, is why do we think Zweig begins the novel not with Edgar's perspective, but with the Baron's? Really, we don't get Edgar's perspective in detail, right, in any substantial way. We get a little bit of it in chapter 2, which we're going to look at, but we really don't get it in any substantial way until a few chapters into the novel. So why not start with Edgar arriving? Why start with the Baron? Well, in some ways, I think if we're trying to capture the experience of growing up as a child, one, I think, important element of growing up that Zweig captures here by starting this way is sometimes when we're very little, we don't even feel like ourselves. We don't even feel like we have a sense of ourselves. It's completely reasonable to begin the novel outside the boy's perspective, because perhaps at the beginning Zweig is trying to suggest the boy doesn't even really have a sense of perspective, a sense of self. He is, it's not that he's not conscious. He's obviously conscious. I think he's supposed to be 12 years old in the novel. So obviously he is literally conscious, right? We remember things at 12 about our lives, but Zweig is sort of using the idea of perspective and point of view, I think, to emphasize what it feels like to come into yourself, to come of age. At the beginning, Edgar isn't even the point of view character of the novella. By the end, by the last page, we're going to be so deep in his perspective, in his thoughts, and in his interiority. And I think that experience of moving from being outside his perspective to being deeply inside his head, to being deeply rooted in his thoughts, that is part of the profound beauty of the novel. Sort of like we're slowly zooming in on Edgar, and by the end we are in his head, we are in his thoughts. And so I like that aspect of the novel, that we don't actually begin in Edgar's perspective. Instead, our first introduction to Edgar is from the outside. It is from the Baron's perspective. So let's take a look at this opening. The Baron arrives, right? He's at the hotel, he's wondering and considering what he's going to do, right? We have a whole section about how he's a womanizer, right? How he's interested in women and finding women and seducing them. And she appears, and we have this description. A tall, voluptuous figure in silk crackled by his table, followed by a small pale boy in a black velvet suit. The boy eyed the Baron curiously as the two seated themselves at a table reserved for them opposite to him. The child was making evident efforts to be correct in his behavior, but propriety seemed to be out of keeping with the dark, restless expression of his eyes. So our first introduction to the boy, right, is the Baron seeing him and his mother, right, as they enter the hotel's dining room. And the emphasis here is on, I think it's important, is on the dark, restless eyes. That, I think, is our clue that the boy is going to be an important character, even though he is not, and really our protagonist ultimately, though we don't quite know that yet. But that's what sort of signals that he's an important character, those dark, restless, the dark, restless expression in his eyes, suggesting some sort of inner turmoil, an inner restlessness in the boy. He is not just a side character. He's not just someone for the Baron to see. He is going to be important and eventually the focus. So I think that's interesting. Our first glimpse of the boy is kind of from the outside, but the detail that we notice, the detail that Zweig includes, is the dark, restless expression of his eyes. That's always nice if you can, when you're first introducing a character, there's a lot you can describe about a person, but if you can focus on one or two key details that become symbolic, that become almost metonymic of this character, that is a really effective way of first introducing a character into a novel, especially from the outside looking in. Now, I want to jump to chapter 2 because this is where we get our first perspective, really our first perspective from the boy, right? Our first shift into the boy's point of view in chapter 2. Before we do, actually, there is one more paragraph where the Baron kind of judges and thinks about this boy. So this is sort of set the next morning, right, after they've kind of met. They've looked at each other, right, the Baron and the mother. But the next morning we have this paragraph in chapter 2. The Baron took his first good look at the boy. He seemed to be a shy, undeveloped, nervous little fellow, about 12 years old. His movements were jerky, his eyes dark and restless. So again, that detail is re-emphasized, right? The dark and restless eyes to highlight it, to underscore it. And he made the impression, so often produced by children of his age, of being scared, as if he had just been roused out of sleep and placed in strange surroundings. His face was not unbeautiful, but still quite undecided. The struggle between childhood and young manhood seemed just about to be setting in. Everything in him was so far like dough that has been kneaded but not formed into a loaf. Nothing was expressed in clean lines. Everything was blurred and unsettled. He was at that hobbledehoy age when clothes do not fit, and sleeves and trousers hang slouchily, and there is no vanity to prompt care of one's appearance. So, we have this description of the boy, and notice how many details are there to emphasize that he is almost incomplete in some way, underdeveloped, not yet fulfilled. And that makes sense because this is a Bildungsroman. This is a coming-of-age story from the young boy's perspective. Right, what's the emphasis here? Shy, undeveloped, nervous little fellow. That's the first phrase Zweig uses. And he seems scared. He seems like he's been placed in strange surroundings, which in some way he has, right? The context we later learn is that he has been brought to this resort by his mother at the request of his father to help his health, right? That he's a sickly boy in some ways. And as we're going to see, the resort does help him, right? Does help him develop, though not necessarily in the way his parents might have intended. But the resort does have its effect on him, right? The seduction that happens there between the Baron and his mother has this nurturing effect, as we're going to see, on the boy. But for now, at the beginning, the emphasis is that the boy still needs growing, still needs to be formed and developed. There's that wonderful description of him as like a bunch of dough that has been kneaded but not yet formed into a loaf. And then the emphasis on how his clothes don't quite fit right. Sleeves and trousers hang, and his appearance doesn't seem right. So the idea is he's awkward. He doesn't seem settled into himself, right? It's a physical way of describing a character who has not yet experienced the transformation, who has not grown comfortable with himself and who he is and his relationship to the world. And that's what this novel is going to be about how Edgar changes from the image of this little boy we see at the beginning. Now, the first time we enter his head is right after this, in this next scene. So the Baron decides to talk to Edgar because he realizes this could be an opportunity of seducing the mother, right? Kind of using Edgar, using the boy to get to the mother. So he starts talking to the boy. And we then get into Edgar's head. Could it be true that this stranger, this elegant gentleman, was trying to pick up a conversation with him whom nobody had ever before cared a rap about? It made him both shy and proud. He pulled himself together with difficulty. So we get the first entry into Edgar's point of view. And at this point, he's kind of enamored by the Baron, right? Remember, we've emphasized that the Baron is dashing, he's wealthy, he's young, he's sophisticated, right? So we understand that obviously he's trying to seduce the mother, who he will, but Edgar is also interested in him. Edgar also finds him interesting and fascinating, especially because, as we see here, he's taking an interest in Edgar. Now, of course, later when Edgar realizes that this was all just a ploy to get to his mother, his feelings towards the Baron are going to change dramatically. But for now, he has these very positive, almost fawning feelings about the Baron. And so this is kind of the setup now for the novel. This is the setup here for the novel. And the first part of the novel, which we're not going to touch on too much because I'm mostly interested in the ending, which is where a lot of Edgar's transformation happens in those final chapters. But the first part of the novel, the first section of the novel, it really just focuses on kind of the development of this game. That's how it's often described by the Baron. It's a game, it's a play it's a game he's playing to try and seduce the mother through the boy. And it's kind of this back and forth between these three characters. We dip in and out of each of their points of view. The mother is resisting, right? Because obviously she is married and she does not want to have the affair at first, but she is also charmed and enamored. The boy is curious, right, as he sees this gentleman and his mother, and gradually starts to become angry and irritated as they seem more interested in each other than in him. And of course, the Baron, right, is simply cynical, right, using Edgar to try and get close to the mother. One section I want to look at, right, here, in chapter 3, we have a nice little passage in which Edgar we get really deep into Edgar's perspective, and we start to see the way Edgar is changing in response to the attention from the Baron. So this is at night, right? This is in the middle of chapter 3. Edgar did not sleep well that night. A chaos of happiness and childish despair filled his soul. Something new had come to him that day. For the first time, he had played a part in the life of adults. Right? So this is right after he has sort of brought, essentially, right, his mother and the Baron together, as the Baron had intended. In his half-awake state, he forgot that he was a child, and all at once felt himself a grown man. Brought up an only child and often ailing, he had never had many friends. His parents, who paid little attention to him, and the servants had been the only ones to meet his craving for tenderness. And so what we have in this moment is Edgar is basically feeling, the key line is there, he feels like a grown man for the first time. He doesn't feel like a child. So we're getting this sense, they're getting this inkling that Edgar is about to grow up, that Edgar is in the process of growing up. Right? I love that phrase, a chaos of happiness and childish despair filled his soul. Right? Childish despair basically because he's been sent to bed, right, by his mom. And he doesn't like that he's being sent to bed, even though this is what always happens, right? He's starting to kind of chafe against being treated like a child by his mother. But he's also excited because he says he's played a part in the life of adults. He's fascinated now by the life of adults. And the rest of this kind of chapter, the rest of this section, really emphasizes how for now, it's the Baron, right, who earns his kind of rapturous adulation, right, his rapturous adoration. The Baron is the one who he really loves at this point, as he feels that the Baron has become a friend, basically. He feels that the Baron has become his friend, and the emphasis is that he never really had a lot of friends growing up. And so Edgar is experiencing the first inklings of growing up. Now, of course, and this is the other, I think, wisdom of starting from the Baron's perspective. We know that the Baron is playing Edgar just to try and get to his mother. We know that the Baron doesn't actually care about Edgar. So I think that's the other important reason why Zweig started in the Baron's perspective, is because as adults now, we know, who are reading this, right, we know something that Edgar does not. We know the truth about the Baron's motives. And so when Edgar discovers the truth behind those motives, right, which is essentially the burning secret that gives this novel its title, when Edgar discovers that, he's going to experience a pretty profound disillusionment. And so there's a little bit of what we call dramatic irony in this section. Edgar feels this love for the Baron, this friendship for the Baron, but we know that the friendship is false. We know that Edgar's feelings are misguided because the Baron doesn't feel that way. And on the one hand, this makes sense, right? We want this dramatic irony to create tension around Edgar's discovery of the Baron's true motives and what's really going to happen between the Baron and his mother. On the other hand, right, it does create some distance between us and Edgar at the beginning of this novel. But what I think is, again, fascinating, by the end of this novella, that distance between us and Edgar is traversed. There is no more distance between us and Edgar at the end of this novella. And that's what makes those final chapters, which we're going to linger on for a little bit and read a few passages from, that's what makes those final passages so profound, is because Zweig accomplishes something really remarkable, which is that he begins a novel distant from the protagonist and then brings us closer to the protagonist just at the moment that the protagonist experiences profound transformation. And that's what makes this novel so powerful. That's what makes it such an affecting novel, is the way the distance closes. Here in chapter 3 at the beginning, we still have distance. Now, before we get to the end, though, before we get to the last part of the novel, I want to look at the middle, right? Because there is a chapter in the middle that is titled The Burning Secret. And this is, of course, when Edgar starts to begins to understand that there is some secret between his mother and the Baron that he doesn't yet understand, but he understands enough to know that this secret contains everything, right? That this secret, which of course is desire, passion, love, sex, is all these things wrapped together, that this secret is what's motivating his mother and the Baron to proceed basically with this flirtation, with this seduction. So let's look at this chapter. This is chapter 7, titled The Burning Secret. So it begins with a question. What has made them so different? The child pondered while sitting opposite them in the carriage. Why don't they behave toward me as they did at first? Why does Mama avoid my eyes when I look at her? Why does he always try to joke when I'm around and make a silly of himself? They don't talk to me as they did yesterday or the day before yesterday. Their faces even seem different. Mama's lips are so red, she must have rouged them. I never saw her do that before. And he keeps frowning as though he were offended. Could I have said anything to annoy them? No, I haven't said a word. It cannot be on my account that they're so changed. Even their manner toward each other is not the same as it was. They behave as though they had been naughty and didn't dare confess. They don't chat the way they did yesterday, nor laugh. They're embarrassed. They're concealing something. They've got a secret between them that they don't want to tell me. I'm going to find it out. I must. I don't care what happens. I must. I believe I know what it is. It must be the same thing that grown-up people always shut me out from when they talk about it. It's what books speak of, and it comes in operas when the men and women on the stage stand singing face to face with their arms spread out and embrace and shove each other away. It must have something to do with my French governess, who behaved so badly with Papa and was dismissed. All these things are connected. I feel they are, but I don't know how. Oh, to find it out, at last to find it out, that secret. To possess the key that opens all doors. Not to be a child any longer, with everything kept hidden from one and always being held off and deceived. Now or never, I will tear it from them, that dreadful secret. So that is just a fantastic passage, this beautiful moment of interiority from Edgar's perspective, right? The inner longing for knowledge of the world, for knowledge of sex, right? Which is what he's talking about, which is the thing he's kind of floating around, right? The knowledge of this secret that he knows. And what's so great about this passage is the way he starts describing how it's the line where he says, I believe I know what it is. Right? So he sees something has changed between his mother and the Baron. They don't talk to him the same way, and they seem to be interacting with themselves differently, right? As if they're hiding something. And he can't quite name it, but the key line there, he says, I know what it is. He knows deep down what the secret is, and then he starts going through all these other situations that we as adult readers recognize and understand in a slightly deeper way than he does, right? When he talks about what the books speak of, what grown-up people always shut me out from, what the people in operas sing about when they embrace, and he even knows that it might have something to do with the French governess who behaved badly with his papa and was dismissed. He says, all these things are connected. I feel they are, but I don't know how. It's such a wonderful way of describing a young person, a child, 12 years old, about to cross that threshold of knowledge of the world. We're witnessing a child right at the edge of knowing and understanding, but not there yet. And what I love about this is, I mean, we all obviously have grown up, right? We've all experienced what Edgar is describing here. But the truth is, in real life, we can't necessarily identify that moment that we crossed that threshold of knowledge. we experienced, I know I experienced, and I think everyone experienced something like what Edgar is describing. This desire to know something, this sense that you almost have it, that you almost have this knowledge. But I couldn't pinpoint when I crossed that threshold, and I think most of us couldn't. It happened sometime in our childhood, but we don't know exactly when or how. And what's beautiful and brilliant about novels like this is they dramatize for us an experience that we have all had, but with a greater specificity than we might remember or than we might know about ourselves. We have more access to Edgar's inner thoughts at this moment of transformation than we do to our own. Right? We probably don't remember exactly what we were thinking when we went through an experience like this. But that's the power of a novel, right? It shows to us our own lives reflected in new ways and in more specific ways. And it helps bring clarity to our own experiences. And that's kind of, again, what we're seeing here, right? Edgar at the very edge of knowledge, almost there. And this passage, again, the deep level of interiority, the kind of zooming, think about what we said earlier, how far now we've zoomed into Edgar's point of view. We are now in his head, hearing his direct thoughts and experiencing this intensity of emotion, this intense desire to know. Right? So from here, this is sort of essentially the midpoint of the novel. This is basically halfway through the novel. So the second half of the novel, things change, right? In the first half, the Baron is nice to Edgar and kind of using Edgar to get to his mother. Now Edgar starts to suspect something, and the tables kind of turn a little bit. Now the mother and the Baron are trying to basically go off together without Edgar. They're trying to get rid of him, essentially, so they can be together, so they can spend time together. And Edgar starts to realize this and to understand this, and he doesn't yet quite know why. He doesn't have full access to the secret, the burning secret. But in response to what's happening between the mother and the Baron, he starts to act out angrily against them, right? He starts to turn on both of them. He starts to get angry at the Baron because he essentially realizes that the Baron wasn't really interested in friendship with him, was just using him to get to his mother. And he is angry at his mother. He's angry at his mother for essentially abandoning him, is how he puts it. And so we have these various scenes where he's continually kind of acting out as they try and get a moment together away from him. One scene in particular I want to look at, let's take a look at, this is a chapter titled The Liars, chapter 9. And again, notice even the chapter titles, that is from Edgar's perspective, right? The liars are his mother and the Baron, and that reflects how Edgar feels at this moment. He thinks they are lying to him. They are liars. And the tension here is, of course, that, Edgar keeps getting in the way of anything happening between them, right? The Baron and the mother are trying, essentially, to make love, and Edgar keeps interrupting them in various ways. Edgar keeps preventing them from finding that time alone together. Let's look at the middle of the chapter. Basically, they send him off to the post office, right, so they can go and escape and find time together. And he comes back, right, and he sees them driving off together. And here's the little passage. He says, "He turned rigid with anger and had the impulse to pick up a stone and throw it at them. So they had escaped him after all, but by what a mean, contemptible lie. He had discovered the day before that his mother lied, but that she could so wantonly disregard a definite expressed promise shattered his last remnant of confidence. He could not understand life at all anymore, now that he realized that the words which he had thought clothed a reality were nothing more than bursting bubbles. But what a dreadful secret it must be that drove grown-up people to such lengths, to lie to him, a child, and to steal away like criminals. In the books he had read, men deceived and murdered one another for money, power, empire. But what was the motive here? What were his mother and the Baron after? Why did they hide from him? What were they with their lies trying to conceal? He racked his brain for answers to the riddle. Vaguely he divined that this secret was the bolt which, when unlocked, opened the door to let out childhood, and to master it meant to be grown up, to be a man at last. Oh, to know what it was! But he could no longer think clearly. His rage at their having escaped him was like a fire that sent scorching smoke into his eyes, and kept him from seeing. So another wonderful passage of Edgar's emotional transformation. He's getting closer now. He's getting closer. He sees that they lie now. He understands that his mother and the Baron can lie. And there's that great line where he says he could not understand life at all anymore now that he realized that the words which he had thought clothed a reality were nothing more than bursting bubbles. It's a wonderful description and a wonderful metaphor there of bursting bubbles, of what it feels like for a child to realize, right, that people can lie and that reality is not necessarily what people say it is, right? That the words people say don't represent reality. I think the metaphor of the bubble is so good because a bubble is very childlike, the childlike idea of blowing bubbles, right? It has this innocent association, and the idea of the bubble bursting, the bubble popping, represents the end of that innocence. And that's what Edgar is experiencing here, the gradual end of his innocence and of his childhood. And once again, he comes back to the idea of the burning secret, right? He knows there is something that his mother and the Baron are after. And he even understands that, and this is the great metaphor he uses, the secret was the bolt which, when unlocked, opened the door to let out childhood. And to master it meant to be grown up, to be a man at last. Right? He uses this image of the door throughout the novel to describe this secret, right? Knowing the secret means unlocking the door, and unlocking the door means stepping forward into the rest of his life, no longer being a child. And I love this because when we get to the ending, this is essentially what happens. He learns the secret, and we witness him essentially unbolting the door, stepping out and becoming a man, no longer becoming a child, becoming grown up. And so Zweig is kind of hinting to us several times with this metaphor, with these images, the process that Edgar is about to undergo. But he hasn't undergone it yet. There's just a little tension here. The emphasis is that he's so angry that it prevents him from really seeing. So at what point does he experience the transformation then? How does this novel kind of conclude? So he sees his mother and the Baron, and they've got their arms around each other. And that's the closest he sees to what they're about to do. So, he confronts his mother and the Baron, right? And he even hits his mother. That's the really important thing, right? He's so angry and he's so upset that he basically lashes out with his fists and he hits his mother. And he's so kind of terrified by what he does, by what he's done, that he runs away, that he runs from the hotel. And then we get the most beautiful set of chapters in this novel, right? Starting with this chapter, right? Chapter 13, titled Dawning Perception, where he runs away and he essentially decides, well, okay, where am I going to run away to? Where can I go? He says, I could go to my father, but my father will send me straight back to the hotel. So he decides basically to go to his grandmother. And he basically decides that she would he's going to stay with her until everything blows over. And so he decides to go to the train, right? And he buys a ticket. And remember the train at the beginning, right, that arrived in Summering. And now we get the train again coming back. The train is really important because this is going to be the vehicle for Edgar's transformation, right? When he gets on this train and rides the train out from the resort. Right, and this whole process of going to the train station, buying a ticket, getting a third-class ticket, instead of, it seems like he travels usually first class, right, with his parents, sitting down with the others, it's all so new to him, and Zweig does such a wonderful job of showing how, as he goes through this process, as he thinks about what to do, as he considers, we see him growing up. We see him realizing that the world is bigger than he realizes, and there are things in the world that he was never aware of. Right? He even says he used to reflect on the idea of running away all the time, and now that he's actually doing it, he realizes how difficult it is. And in particular, because he's in the third-class carriage, he really sees people who don't have money and have to work to earn money. And this is something that really bothers him, that really disturbs him, right? It's this fact about the world that he had been so sheltered from, had been so insulated from. And if we read this passage kind of towards the middle of the chapter, now he's on the train and he's writing, Edgar was learning a good deal in that single hour of aloneness, and saw many things as he looked out of his narrow compartment into the great wide world. And for all his dark dread, something began to unfold itself gently within him. Not exactly happiness as yet, rather a marveling at the diversity of life. He had fled, he felt, out of fear and cowardice, yet it was his first independent act, and he had experienced something of the reality that he had passed by until then without heeding it. Perhaps he himself was now as much of a mystery to his mother and his father as the world had been to him. It was with different eyes that he looked out of the window. He was now viewing actualities, it seemed to him. A veil had been lifted from all things, and they were showing him the core of their purpose, the secret spring of their actions. Houses flew by as though torn away by the wind, and he pictured to himself the people living in them. Were they rich or poor, happy or unhappy? Were they filled with the same longing as he to know everything? And were there children in those houses like himself, who had merely been playing with things? The flagmen who waved the train no longer seemed like scattered dolls, inanimate objects, toys stationed there by indifferent chance. Edgar now understood that the giving of the signal was their fate, their struggle with life. So just a remarkable passage where we see Edgar transforming in real time. We see the moment of his transformation. He's looking out the window and he's alone. That's the important thing. It says that single hour of aloneness. And he's seeing so many things about the world that the dread that he felt, right, the fear and cowardice that had led him to flee, as the passage says, that changes to, and it doesn't say it's happiness as yet, but instead a marveling at the diversity of life. So this experience of leaving, of getting on the train, what he calls his first independent act, exposes him to reality, and he marvels at the world. He's not scared anymore. He's not afraid. He marvels. And he starts asking these questions about all the people he sees, the houses he sees. Are there people living in them? Do they have the same feelings and thoughts as I do? Are they happy or unhappy? And the flagmen at the train stations, he suddenly sees that they are people too. They are not just dolls or objects. I mean, it's such a wonderful way to evoke this dawning understanding that you have as a child, that other people are like you. They have a consciousness in them, just like you have a consciousness in you. They have the same fears, anxieties, loves, etc., the same emotions. They feel the same emotions that you do. Again, as I said earlier, we've all experienced this. We all understand that this is what it means to grow up, to learn and understand these things, to have this new sense of your place in the world. But we can never necessarily pinpoint the moment that this happened for us, that this dawning awareness or transformation happened, this dawning perception, to use the title of the chapter. And what's so great about a novel like this is that it shows us, it dramatizes us to us the moment that something like this could happen. It takes a familiar sensation and a familiar experience and shows someone going through that experience with that specificity. And that's what's so beautiful about this and just about novels in general. It just moves me so much to read this and think about what a joy it is that we get to read novels, that we get to see people in novels experience the things that we've experienced. I mean, that is so profoundly moving when you think about it. And that's what Zweig is capturing and depicting here. And then the conclusion of this chapter, just to kind of conclude it here, the wheels turned faster and faster. Along serpentine windings, the train made its way downward from the uplands. The mountains took on gentler curves and receded into the distance. The level was reached, and Edgar gave one final glance backward. There were the mountains, like blue shadows, remote and inaccessible. And to Edgar, it was as though his childhood were reposing up there, where they lightly merged with the misty heavens. So the final image here, again, it connects to the opening of the novel where the train arrived at the resort. Now the train is leaving, and we see those same mountains that we saw at the beginning, and Edgar feels that his childhood is up there in those mountains. So the train has literally been the vehicle that has taken him from childhood to adulthood here. It's not the end, though. There's going to be some more transformations that he's going to experience, but he's starting to feel this change, that childhood has been left behind, and the train is the symbol of it. Now we understand why Zweig began this novel with the train. The train was not just an accidental description. The train was essential to set up this moment, to set up this paragraph. All right, so now, though, we get to an even more profound chapter. He now arrives basically in the town of Baines, right, where his grandmother lives. And he worries basically about what he's going to say, how he's going to explain himself. And so he doesn't actually enter the house, and he runs off. And basically, he goes to a park. He goes off to a park, and it's dark, right? It's dark. That's important. And he's in the park, and he's just hoping to find a place to sit down and rest and kind of think about what's happened. Now, we're going to read this section, it's a long section, but we're going to read it because Zweig is a master of psychology, right? It's no accident that around this time, in this part of the world, the great psychologists Freud and Jung were doing their work. Freud in Vienna itself, right? The same city where Zweig is from. And this section, I think, is intensely psychological, and it uses a lot of symbols to evoke this transformation for Edgar. And I think the darkness is an important symbol. So this first description of the park, let's just take a look here. When he reached the park, he paused. It was dark there, and he expected to find it empty, and thought it would be a good place to sit down and rest, and at last reflect quietly, and come to some understanding with himself about his fate. He passed through the gateway timidly. A few lamps were burning near the entrance, giving the young leaves on the trees a ghostly gleam of transparent green. But deeper in the park, down the hill, everything lay like a single black fermenting mass in the darkness. So he's quite literally entering this dark kind of abyss, right? We use these terms when we describe transformations that characters experience near the end of novels, near the end of stories, the dark night of the soul, right? It's this term that screenwriters have kind of taken up, but it goes all the way back to Catholic mysticism to reflect this kind of moment of intense inner transformation that a person might experience through kind of self-reflection. A lot of times you can dramatize this kind of dark night of the soul, and that's essentially what Edgar is going to experience here when he enters this park in the darkness. He's going to enter this abyss, this cave, and he's going to leave transformed, right? It's all intensely psychological and symbolic. So the darkness is really important. This scene wouldn't work if it was daytime in the park. It has to be nighttime. It has to be what's described here, a single black fermenting mass in the darkness. And so let's keep reading. Edgar, eager to be alone, slipped past the few people who were sitting in the light of the lamps, talking or reading. But even in the deep shadows of the unilluminated pathways, it was not quiet. There were low whisperings that seemed to shun the light. Sounds mingled with the rustling of the leaves, the scraping of feet, subdued voices, all mingled with a certain voluptuous, sighing, groaning sound that seemed to emanate from people and animals and nature, all in a disturbed sleep. It was a restlessness that had something foreboding in it, something sneaking, hidden, puzzling, a sort of subterranean stirring in the wood that was connected perhaps with nothing but the spring, yet had a peculiarly alarming effect upon the child. So what is he experiencing here, right? He's going through the park at night. There are people talking and reading, and he's describing the sounds he hears, right? The low whisperings. And look at the words that Zweig uses, that the translator here uses. So I didn't credit the translator, by the way, earlier, because apparently this version, the translator is not known for this public domain version. There are other translators for future versions. But anyway, continuing here, look at the words that Zweig uses and that this unnamed translator uses to describe the sounds of the darkness in the park, right? Voluptuous, sighing, groaning sound that seemed to emanate from people and animals and nature. I mean, that is a very sexual sound. That is the sound of sex. That's what he's describing. It's almost this earthy, sensual, sexual sound that he is hearing as he's entered this dark park. He describes it as a subterranean stirring, right? Something sneaking, hidden, and puzzling. He doesn't realize it yet, but this is the burning secret, right, that he is trying to understand. If we keep reading, he cowered into a diminutive heap on a bench and tried to think of what he was to say at home. But his thoughts slipped away from him as on a slippery surface before he could grasp his own ideas. And in spite of himself, he had to keep listening and listening to the muffled tones, the mystical voices of the darkness. How terrible the darkness was, how bewildering and yet how mysteriously beautiful. So what does he experience here, right? He's experiencing these sounds of the darkness, these kind of sensual, earthy sounds, and they're beautiful to him, right? They're mysteriously beautiful. Were they animals or people, or was it merely the ghostly hand of the wind that wove together all this rustling and crackling and whirring? He listened. It was the wind gently moving the treetops. No, it wasn't. It was people. Now he could see it distinctly. Couples arm in arm who came up from the lighted city to enliven the darkness with their perplexing presence. What were they after? He could not make out. They were not talking to each other because he heard no voices. All he could catch was the sound of their tread on the gravel, and here and there the sight of their figures moving like shadows past some clear space between the trees, always with their arms round each other, like his mother and the Baron in the moonlight. So he sees couples, right? He sees figures entering this park, and we as readers understand why they're here, right? They're here to have sex, right, in the darkness, in a private, dark place, right? Which is perhaps sounds strange to us in the present, but, this was something that happened in these parks at night, right? These clandestine meetings between people. And he sees it. He sees these people, and he connects them with the Baron and his mother, right, with their arms around each other, right? And he understands that this is the secret, basically. And then look at the next line. So the great, dazzling, portentous secret was here too. He understands now that this is the same secret. This is the burning secret, this secret of sex, right? That he's been circling around and around. If we keep reading, steps approached, a subdued laugh. Edgar, for fear of being discovered, drew deeper into the dark. But the couple, now groping their way in the deep gloom, had no eyes for him. They passed him by, closely locked, and they stopped only a few feet beyond his bench. They pressed their faces together. Edgar could not see clearly, but he heard a soft groan from the woman, and the man stammering mad, ardent words. A sort of sultry presentiment touched Edgar's alarm with a shudder that was sensual and pleasant. So he sees in the darkness this couple kissing, and he hears the woman groan with pleasure. And it touches something in Edgar, right? Look at that last line. A sort of sultry presentiment touched Edgar's alarm with a shudder that was sensual and pleasant. So he does not react to this image of love and of sex and of sensuality in the same way that he did with his mother and the Baron. If we continue, the couple stayed thus a minute or so, and then the gravel crunched under their tread again, and the sound of their footsteps died away in the darkness. A tremor went through Edgar. His blood whirled hot through his veins, and all of a sudden he felt unbearably alone in this bewildering darkness, and the need came upon him with elemental force for the sound of a friend's voice, an embrace, a bright room, people he loved. The whole perplexing dark of this night seemed to be inside his breast and rending it. So he takes all this darkness, right? The sounds, the sort of sensual sounds of the park at night, the image that he sees. He feels like it's inside him. He feels like it's rending him. He feels the pain of growing up. He feels now the pain of becoming aware of the burning secret, aware of the secret of life. And again, it's so profoundly described, the way Zweig physicalizes this emotion, this feeling, as a pain inside his chest. It's not just cerebral. It's not just in his head. This is something I always say to my students in my creative writing classes. Take the feelings that your characters are feeling and express them in physical sensations. Express them with sensory details, because then they are so much more powerful. They allow the readers to connect so much more directly, and we understand. We connect here. And basically he decides to go back. Like, this is the climactic moment of transformation. He has changed now. He has crossed the threshold. He has opened that door, unbolted and opened that door and passed through. He understands the burning secret. And it happens in this darkness, in this abyss-like, cave-like dark space, dark park, where he sees another version of what his mom and the Baron were doing. And he hears another version of it. And then he understands. And it's so beautifully done and so beautifully depicted. And the power of it is the fact that Zweig takes us through it in real time. Zweig takes us through Edgar's experience from innocent child who doesn't even get a point of view at the beginning of the novel to this profound interiority, this deep, profound, direct, emotional interiority to describe what Edgar is feeling as he grows up. I really think this novel is one of the most beautiful depictions of the experience of growing up that I have ever read. And part of that is because it is so perfectly contained in one child's experience, in one moment. It's not diffused across a summer, right, or a year or two. It is concentrated. The beauty of a novella is this economy and concentration. And so the novella is the perfect form to depict this kind of transformation. Let's look at one last passage towards the end, right? So we do have, the end of the novel is important, right? Because basically Edgar goes back. He goes back to his grandmother's house. He sees his parents again. And his father basically asks, right, why did you run away? And his mother is there, and there's this moment where his mother looks at him. So let's just look at this scene towards the end. So this is right towards the end of the novel, almost at the end. So the father asks, what got into your head to run away? How could you give your mother such a fright? And his mother is in the room as well. And Edgar sort of thinks. He wonders what to say, right? Should he tell the actual story, or should he lie? Remember earlier how badly Edgar reacted to the knowledge that his mother and the Baron lied to him, right? It was this profound moment of pain for him, that reality was not what people said it was. And then he looks at his mother here. Let's look at this section. So his father asks, you must have had some good reason for running away. Did anyone do anything to you? Edgar hesitated. At the recollection of the events in Summering, his anger began to flare up again, and he was about to bring his charge against his mother when he saw, his heart stood still, that she was making an odd gesture behind his father's back. At first he did not comprehend, but he kept his eyes fixed on her and noticed that the expression of her face was beseeching. Then, very, very softly, she lifted her finger to her mouth in sign that he should keep everything to himself. So she's beseeching him. That's the word that's used. She's beseeching him. He's about to reveal it all, and he sees this expression on his mother's face. And now look at his reaction. The child was conscious of a great, wild joy pouring in a warm wave over his whole body. He knew she was giving him the secret to guard, and that a human destiny was hanging in the balance on his child's lips. Filled with a jubilant pride that she reposed confidence in him, he suddenly became possessed by a desire for self-sacrifice. He magnified his own wrongdoing in order to show how much of a man he had grown to be. So he basically lies, right, to his father. And notice the phrasing that's used, right? When his mother basically asks him to lie, he feels joy. It's described as a great wild joy pouring in a warm wave over his whole body. Because, why does he feel joy? He feels that she's giving him the secret, the burning secret. He knows it now. And she knows that he knows, and she's telling him, lie for me. And to him, that's profound because she is treating him like an adult, not a child. Right, with that one single gesture, putting her finger to her lips, she is asking him to be an adult, not a child, to lie. And that's what Edgar has realized, that the adult world is not the simple world of childhood. And the fact that he decides to lie, on his mother's behalf to his father, and the fact that he realizes that this is the correct thing to do, is the best sign of how transformed he has become, how he has gone from child to man. And it even says so. It even says so at the end here, right? How much of a man he had grown to be. Now, before we conclude, I want to just look at one more passage here. So they send him to bed, right? So this passage toward the end. It's not the very end of the novel, but almost. They sent him to bed, but he was not now distressed at being left alone. He had such a wealth of things to think over. All the agony of the past days was dissipated by the tremendous sense of his first experience of life. He felt happy in a mysterious presentiment of future experiences. Outside, the trees were rustling in the gloomy night, but he was not scared. He had lost all impatience at having to wait for life, now that he knew how rich it was. For the first time that day, it seemed to him, he had seen life naked, no longer veiled behind the thousand lies of childhood. He saw it in its complete, fearful, voluptuous beauty. Notice the word voluptuous. It's the same word that was used to describe that sound in the darkness in the park. Never had he supposed that days could be crowded so full of transitions from sorrow to joy and back again, and it made him happy to think there were many more such days in store for him, and that a whole life was waiting to reveal its mystery to him. A first inkling had come to him of the diversity of life. For the first time, he thought, he understood men's beings, that they heeded each other even when they seemed to be inimical, and that it was very sweet to be loved by them. He was incapable of thinking of anything or anybody with hate. He regretted nothing, and had a sense of gratitude even to the Baron, his bitterest enemy, because it was he who had opened the door for him to this world of dawning emotions. So I just love that passage. It's not the end of the novel. There's, a little bit more, but that passage really conveys Edgar's transformation. And the emphasis there, look at the emphasis. He's so happy, right? He's so happy and excited for life. Think of how different this is from that first image of Edgar that we saw at the beginning. That boy whose clothes didn't fit quite right. That boy who was so awkward and shy and scared. Look how much he has transformed. And what's so effective is that we have witnessed him transform through this incredibly detailed and well-done, scene-by-scene story. Zweig has used his narrative to take us through this boy's transformation into this person at the end, right? And what does he feel? He feels so excited about the possibility of more experiences. He feels so excited about the diversity of life. It's such a moving passage because, again, it's what I've said earlier. It's what we all have experienced at some point. Only Zweig, by isolating it to this specific incident, makes it feel so profound. And again, that's the power of literature, right? It makes us, we see these experiences that are in some cases universal, the experience of growing up. We might not have the particular experience that he does, but the universality of this is the transformation. And when we read, yes, we can connect our lives to the lives of the characters. I mean, this is why whenever people say things to me about how, I didn't like this novel because the characters weren't really relatable to me, they didn't have anything to do with my life, I only read books in which the characters are exactly like me. I hate that. That's not literature. That's not culture, right? That's just solipsism. That's just selfishness, right? You can read about characters who are totally different from you and feel this profound connection, right? Zweig is an Austrian writer from the early 20th century, writing about a young boy in a spa town. We might have nothing to do with this boy. Maybe you've never even gone to Austria. Maybe you've never gone to a spa town. Maybe your mother has never committed an indiscretion, right? Maybe none of the facts about this boy's life are familiar to you. Maybe you're not even a boy. Maybe you're not even male. Maybe you're not white, right? Maybe you're not Austrian. Maybe you're not German. Maybe you have no connection to this boy on the surface level. And yet, I challenge you to read this and not feel some connection to what he's experiencing. How can you read this novel and not feel that profound empathy and emotion, and not feel that there is something similar between you and this fictional boy? That's the power of literature, and that's why this whole movement and trend today of own voices, of this idea that you can only connect with characters who are just like yourself demographically, that's why it's such a terrible, terrible thing to happen to literature, because it fundamentally destroys the very power of literature. The idea that empathy can transcend all of these demographic barriers, right? One of the most profound things I find about Zweig is when I look at the Goodreads page. I know this sounds silly. Look at the Goodreads page for Zweig's novels. For this one, for example, look at the number of reviews, so many more than you would imagine, right? I know on this podcast I've often lamented the death of literature in the 21st century, but I feel such profound faith when I look at something like that, when I see the number of reviews for a novella that I thought was quite obscure, and in particular, the number of reviews written in other languages, right? The international popularity of an author like Stefan Zweig is a testament to the power of literature. And that in and of itself is profoundly moving, that a lot of people read this novel and felt this deep connection. Zweig has accomplished something truly remarkable here with this novel. And, hopefully this kind of going through the novella like this and talking about the transformation has shown us what that is. The other thing, of course, is that to kind of contextualize it just a little bit, right? This is a time period of what we call modernism. Right? This is an era that we might associate with modernism, though Zweig is not really modernist in the way that someone like Joyce is. His sentences, his style of writing, it's still quite classical, right? It's still quite traditional. But the modernist elements of this novel, it's the same thing that we talked about when we read Old Mortality a few weeks ago, or a few months ago. It's the same idea, right? The modernism of both of these novellas, right, comes in the form of the profound interiority, the profound psychological interiority that is achieved, right? Zweig's psychological depth and insight into this boy's transformation is what makes it a modernist novel. It's not the kind of deep psychological insight that you'd get before the 20th century, right? Before the era of Freud and Jung, right? It was in the zeitgeist at the time, these psychological conventions and ideas and symbols. Now they seem kind of obvious to us, but in 1913, when this was published, this type of intense interiority was a new phenomenon that we were seeing in literature, right? The beginnings of what we call modernism. Obviously, it's happened in a lot of other novels, but I find this one to be just a really profound example of it. All right, so on that note, I think that's a perfect place to end it. So thank you guys for listening. I really encourage you to read this novella. It's one of my favorites if you haven't, and hopefully this podcast convinced you to if you haven't already. And yeah, we're going to do more Zweig books in the future because I think he's such a master of the novella form. And it's wonderful, right, when you have these excellent short books, right, that someone can read in a few hours in an afternoon. And yeah, as always, if you enjoyed the podcast, please like, subscribe, and share. And I will see you all next time.